I'm Clarke Speaks, the catastrophic injury lawyer. Welcome to The Verdict. This is 5 Failures from Success.
My name's Carson Grace Toomer, and I'm here with American injury lawyer Clarke Speaks. Now, Mr. Speaks, this series is called Your 5 Failures from Success. Can you explain to me a little bit your philosophy behind kind of this title and why you feel it's so important?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I remember hearing the story of the Chinese farmer. You may have seen it on social media or whatever, but the idea is there's a Chinese farmer and he has a horse, and the horse runs off one day, and all the people in the town come to him and say, hey, that's terrible, your horse ran off. And he says, well, maybe. And the next day the horse comes back with 7 other horses, and all the townspeople say, well, that's great, that's wonderful. And he says, well, maybe. And then the next day his son is riding one of the horses and falls and breaks his leg. And all the townspeople say, that's terrible. Well, maybe. And then the next day, the conscription officers come, and they're drafting people to go off to war. And then they don't draft his son because of the broken leg. And the townspeople come and say, well, that's great, And he says, well, maybe. And the idea, it's not my idea, but it's a good idea. And the idea is that when something bad or good happens in your life, it's not determinative, right? It's not. It may be bad, it may be good. It's just you don't know the rest of the context, and there may be a bigger plan, a bigger picture that you don't see yet. And so, for me, why this is important is because in this series we'll talk about 5 things that happened in my life. I did it, or it was happened to me, or done to me, whatever. But the point of it is that at the time I thought, this is such a colossal, life-changing experience that I will never, it's going to affect me negatively for the rest of my life. And then when I look back on these experiences, without question, these things that I thought were so negative turned out to be by far some of the greatest blessings in my life. And when they happened, you could not have convinced me of that for anything. I thought, oh my goodness, it's just terrible, right? And then now that I have a little bit of more distance and perspective, I can see that those things were not curses, that they were blessings, and that I have benefited greatly from those experiences.
Right. Well, that's a very powerful metaphor. Now, let's really get into these specific failures that you've deemed, were failures at the time but have led to your success or prosperity. Now, what would you say would be the first, big failure in your life that you had that outlook on?
Sure, yeah. Well, so the first thing that comes to mind, it wasn't so much my personal failure, this first thing. Some of the rest of them were, but this first thing is more like something that happened, So I'm 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old, and it was my mother, my brother, my father, and me. We lived together, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a family, like a lot of families, and we didn't have a lot of money, and my dad was in business, and he was expecting to close this big deal, and so like when that happens in a family that doesn't have a whole lot of money, you kind of wait on your bills, right? Maybe your bills, instead of being 30 days, are now 60 days, or maybe 65 days, 70 days, So we're like anticipating this money coming in, and we as a family, sometimes if you're a family that's struggling, even if you're young, if your kids know about all that stuff, and they might even participate in it. Like we'd, pray and try to hope the thing was going to go the way it was supposed to, and it looked like it was going to, and it did. Well, then the day that it's supposed to happen, and we're supposed to get some money, and maybe we catch up on our bills, and maybe do something as a family or whatever. I come home from school that day, and I find a envelope on the kitchen counter, and it's got $1,000 in a letter, and it's from my father, and my father says in the letter, it makes it clear that he's leaving and he has no plans to come back, and it leaves us $1,000, which is not enough to do what we need to do. And I don't, I'm 8 or 9 years old, but I know that. And so about that time, the phone rings, and I answer it, and it's my mom. She's calling. She was a teacher, and she was calling from school. I would get home on the bus before she would get home. And so she says, I don't remember her calling me other times, but somehow this day she happened to call. And I wanted to give her this information, but I also knew that I wanted to be careful about how I gave it to her, because I knew it would worry her, and I knew that it would hurt her feelings, because she got left too, you know. And so that was I didn't know quite how to do that, so I just, came out with it and said, hey, listen, I got something to tell you. There's a letter here and here. And she's like, well, read it to me. And I read it to her. And, I was impressed. One of the first things I learned from that experience was just how strong my mom was, because I knew she was hurt and I knew she was scared, but I saw her be strong, because that's what she had to be. And so she didn't flinch. She didn't, flip out. She just was like, okay, well, thank you, and I'll be home in a little while. And so so I went from being afraid and hurt to being, okay, well, that gives me some kind of confidence that we'll be able to deal with this. We came home and we talked. My mom came home and my brother came home and we talked about it. And we knew things would get difficult, right? Because we were kind of, on the low side of middle class in terms of how we lived and all this. But now, it was going to be a little bit more difficult, right? And we were going to, so, our peer group, would have been here, and then our ability would have been here, and that was going to present certain challenges. And it did, right? We had to depend on our family and our friends and our church for money and help and assistance and all this kind of stuff. And my brother and I had to get jobs. My brother worked at a restaurant, and I delivered newspapers. And we sort of get through this time, but it presented some certain challenges, right? That at the time I thought I was the only person that had these challenges. I thought that it was going to affect the rest of my life in a very negative way. For example, this would have been the 80s and 90s. I imagine the same is probably true now. Like, as a kid, you think it's so important that you have this brand of whatever, right? Like so I remember in my case, it would have been, Nikes. You had to have the, leather Nikes, and you didn't want the canvas Nikes, and God forbid you didn't want the Kugas or whatever it is they sell that were, and there was just we just couldn't afford to have those things, right? Even with my job and my paper out and all that kind of stuff. So, that seemed like such a big deal. Or if I remember we would going on a Boy Scout camping trip, and so everybody else's father would have been there and mine wasn't. Or I'd go to football games, and I played sports growing up in high school. I played football and wrestled and played tennis, and I remember that everybody else's dad would have not all the time, but my perception was that everybody else's parents and families were together and were participating, and I weren't. My mom was working because she taught school, and then in addition to that, she worked at nights and on weekends sometimes in a clothing store to try to make ends meet. And so that was another source. So the money, absent, parents being absent from things that I felt like were important. There was another piece of it too, which is it felt like our family was fractured, splintered, right? I had this idea of what my family was, and then now it was different. It was different from what it was before. And so so for example, for holidays, special occasions, we would go to my relative's house, right? I mean, it'd just be the three of us. So Christmas with just the three of us didn't seem very festive. You know what I mean? We didn't have really money for decorations as much as they did or whatever. So we would go to my aunt's house. My aunt had this huge, beautiful house, and she made everything festive and fun, and she was just warm and dynamic, and it was just fun, and it was awesome, and I loved it. But we were guests, perpetually at Christmas and at Thanksgiving and those kinds of things. It was wonderful because those people made us feel so, welcome and included and a part of it. But there's just a part of it where you're just like, yeah, I don't own this position. I just rent this position within this amazing sort of scenario. And at some point, I got to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when I'm growing up, that was a huge part of what my perception is of what was going on, right? And it seemed to me like everybody else had all these things. They had their father there. They had the money they needed to buy the clothes or the shoes or the car. I didn't have a car everybody else got a car when they were 16. I didn't have a car till I was almost through college, and then that was a car that worked about 3 or 4 days out of the month. Like I remember physically pumping up the tire with a bicycle pump on trying to get to work at different times. So like that was my perception is that my situation was so much different from everybody else's because of this thing that happened in my life.
Right. So it sounds like your father leaving led you to even more so kind of look towards what your peers and your peers' family were doing, and that maybe negatively affected your outlook on life. Is that?
Probably, yeah. It did. If negative, I mean, it affected my perception and affected when I looked at other people, which is always such a dangerous thing. And I think kids do that today, right? They look at other people on social media, and they're like, everybody else is thin, and everybody else is beautiful, and everybody else is doing all these amazing things, and they have 1,000 tons of friends, and they go to these amazing places, and they have this amazing food, and it's just like you're just seeing everybody's projection of what they want you to see, which is okay. You know what I mean? We always want people to see the best versions of ourselves. But again, that's why I think this is so important is I want people to see that that's not always the whole story, that there is because I will promise you that if you went back and you asked people that I went to school with at that age, a lot of them would probably have no idea that this was going on in my life. They would have only my best friends would know that this was what was going on in my life, and a lot of them would have thought I was a lucky compared to them, you know what I mean? And this is just, all this is kind of going on. I mean, the reality is that my dad did leave, and we did have money problems, and we, had a hard time keeping up with it, and we did have to depend on our family and friends and church and all this kind of stuff for, food and but sometimes I got friends to this day whose parents helped us during that time that probably don't even know about it. You know what I mean? I can think of several people that I went to high school with and that were in our church, that would have helped us, neighbors and stuff that would have helped us that they probably to this day don't know that they helped us. So I do think that perception of what's going on in the mind of somebody when they compare themselves to somebody else is an important thing that people need to realize that, hey, other people have challenges too.
Right. What did you think you learned looking back, living through that experience?
There's a few things. First of all, one of the blessings is that my brother and my mother and I became very, very close and got to a place where we could, and it had this impact later. My mom's now 87 years old. She lived with us for years and years and years. My brother and I are super close. I've talked to him on a almost daily basis, certainly this week, And so the relationship that we have was phenomenal. It taught me independence, by having a paper out when I was 8 years old or whatever. I learned from that experience, And when I went through what I thought was a scary time. You know, for example, later in life, my kids are probably 5 and 6 years old. My older two kids, Nicholas and Katie. Nicholas is 6, Katie's 5. We're both have bikes. The bikes have training wheels, and they ride all over the place on their bikes. I'm trying to teach Nicholas to ride his bike without his training wheels. So I take the training wheels off, and then at this point, again, this is, 10, 15 years ago. So we live on a golf course. And so I'm on the cart path with him, and I've got like a pillow strapped to each knee, and a pillow on his back, and a pillow on his front, and a belt around his thing. And I'm running because I'm trying so hard to keep him from experiencing any negative, being hurt, right? I want to protect him, right, from being hurt, And so I'm running up and down the cart path, holding on to this thing, and he's got helmets and knee pads and he's just over the top protection. His mom has something to do with this, to be honest with you. But either way, this is what's going on. In the meantime of me trying to do this, running up and down, where I'm nearly having a heart attack, running up and down the golf course, trying to teach him to ride his bike with no training wheels, I look over to the side, and his little sister has taken the training wheels off of her bike and is blowing past us on her own without any assistance. So the lesson from that, I think, is that, sometimes when we're just thrown in the deep end by ourselves and we don't have anybody there to take our training wheels off and to make sure that we have the crust cut off of our bread and that we have, it gives us an independence and a self-reliance and later a confidence that is irreplaceable. And so for me, not having anybody there during that time, that's not true, not having anybody there. Not having my father there during this time ended up being this amazing gift because it taught me self-reliance, independence, and confidence. The other thing that it did do, and this is something I think that it's critical, is it made me look elsewhere for guidance, for mentorship, for a role model. My dad would be, he's deceased at this point in time. He'd be the first to tell you later in life. Later in life, we reconnected, and we made peace, and he, acknowledged what he had done and not done, and we ended up having a good relationship. But he'd be the first to tell you that at that point in his life, he was not the person that he would have wanted me to be his role model, right? He would not have wanted me to look to him and go, this is how you live life. So because he was absent, I had to look elsewhere, right? I had to look at other people. My mom became, so in other words, Father's Day was recently, and so the first person I thought of was my mom, not my dad, because she was that sort of fulfilled that role. I had uncles. My brother was also, my brother's 5.5 years older than I. And he was such a great role model during this time. He took on the responsibility of being my father in many ways, right? He would help me with sports and athletics. That was a big part of my life growing up. He would, he lived this he had a very unbelievable work ethic, and he kind of showed me about that. He taught me about, fitness, and he taught me about all kinds of different things. And he felt a deep personal responsibility to fill that void, and I thought that was pretty cool. I had uncles that were phenomenal people, and they were good husbands, good fathers, spiritual, faith-based people that gave me a real good example on how to live life. I had a step-grandfather who was just an incredible person, who was went to West Point and was a general in the Air Force and had this incredible, amazing life. And he would, talk to me about things to do and things not to do and how to live life and principles that you should incorporate into your, I had these incredible coaches and teachers. I had this coach, my football coach in high school was one of my favorite When you look back, you ever have a coach where you just have a connection with for whatever reason, and you think back to the things that they say over and over again over the course of your life. Well, for me, that was this guy, Bruce McBride, a football coach that I had, JV football coach that I had in high school. And he was so focused on discipline. And he was focused on discipline for me at a very young age when that was important. So, he would do this, he would talk about this drill, and he talked about how important it was to do it exactly right? Your toes had to be up to the line, not on the line, not over the line, but right up to the line, and that was a metaphor for lots of different things. And so I had Jackie Davis as a teacher, who was just this incredible teacher, and I had coaches and teachers along. But my point is, I might not have been as receptive to listening to those people, to understanding what they had to offer, if I just had one person that I was communicating with on a daily basis. And if he'd have stayed, he would have been communicating some pretty negative examples for me. So that's why I think that his departure presented certain obstacles and problems, and it was psychologically challenging in some ways. But it really turned out to be such a blessing because of the self-reliance, the confidence, the independence. And then it opened all these other role models. It opened my eyes to all these other role models that were in my community, pastors and teachers and, college professors and peers. You know what I mean? Sometimes your peers can be good role models. I've got cousins that later in life, became lawyers and different things, and I was like, okay, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I have friends that were doing amazing things, and I was like, well, shoot, if they can do it, I can do it. And all those things were just blessings that I don't know would have been available to me had I had the path that I had pictured in my mind before this happened.
Right. Now, how and when do you think that clicked for you? Was it, this transition from a negative outlook on life to, the importance of motivation and self-reliance? Was it something that kind of you learned or noticed slowly throughout the course of your life, or was it this like big aha moment that this was such a blessing and I had no idea?
Well, so I think it's relatively recently when I've started when I had kids, I started thinking more about putting all this stuff into perspective. I think I had, once I'm talking to them about, and I see them, and also at work, when I see somebody have something that is terrible happen to them, and I see the way that a lot of my clients have, for example, I have a client who was on the podcast, another series, who was in a bad wreck, and he talks about in the podcast, he was hit by another car. His car's upside down. He's got gas running all over him, and he knows something's wrong. He's paralyzed from the waist down. And there's another person we had on the podcast, Parker Bird, who's the East Carolina baseball player, the first Division I college athlete, I believe, that's played with a prosthetic leg. And I've learned so much from these guys because I see how they are the perfect example of the Chinese farmer, right? They, it's like, hey, this is a terrible thing, and there's no getting around really that if you are paralyzed or you lose a leg, that's a bad thing. You know what I mean? That's not like your dad left, that's just a bad thing. But they still look at it as okay, what can I do from here what good can come out of this situation? And it's not so much, they're not defined by something negative that happened to them. The people that I see that are successful, they're not defined by something negative. They take something negative and they look at it in a way that's optimistic and positive. So if I talk to Colin, who was paralyzed in this accident, what he focuses on is gratitude, which I was like, blown away by, and what his focus on gratitude was, hey, this could have been worse. I'm alive. And then from that, he has built this really incredible life. He has a daughter. He works on the land. He's got a business. He hunts. He fishes. He went to Big Rock last week to watch the tournament and to learn about that. He's fascinated by that. He has a rich, full life, and that is directly a function of his positivity and his optimism and his attitude. And I think that that's such an important thing under these circumstances.
Okay. How did this experience motivate you to succeed and provide stability in your own life and then also your children's lives?
Part of growing up under these circumstances for me was, I did grow up having the confidence to think, hey, I can get through this. But I also had some degree of self-doubt. That ends up being a gift. It sounds funny to say that, and the reason is because you don't grow up thinking you know it all. You don't grow up thinking, I know everything. You grow up, in my mind, thinking, hey, I need to be receptive to other information, coaches, friends, colleagues, And to this day, collaboration is a huge part of what I do, right? If I'm doing something in business, if I'm doing something in law, if I'm doing something, like we have every week we have a meeting where the best minds in our company get together and collaborate on the biggest challenges that we face. And now that I think about it, not just once, but this is pretty much what we do 5 or 6 times a week with different groups, right? Leadership gets together, marketing gets together, legal gets together, and for different groups, exceptional cases, and in that collaboration is directly a function of recognizing that other people have great ideas and being receptive to hearing them and thinking about them, and then collectively deciding what's the best course of action to take. So that's been an evolutionary process for me, and but I've always been sort of, I've always been sort of that way. I get maybe self-doubt might not be the best word for it, but just there's a point at which confidence, I think, can be destructive, and recognizing that I don't care who you are, you don't have all the answers, Last night I'm talking to my 14-year-old, and we're talking about faith, and we're talking about Christianity, which is what we're Christians, and we're talking about the Bible and Jesus and God and all these things, and I don't know all the answers that she's asking. I don't know that, but I know people who do know a lot of these things, and I know where to find a lot of these answers. And I'm also interested to hear what her perceptions are and what her thoughts are. And I think, and again, I think all of those things were made stronger by this experience that I had, that when I was 8 years old, I thought was terminal. I thought was destructive. I thought was harmful. But retrospectively, I think it was an unbelievable blessing. My dad was, by the way, one of those confident guys that he knew everything. He was like, he was good at everything from the time that he was young. He was a phenomenal athlete. He was a phenomenal football player. He was a phenomenal golfer. I learned about records he had in high school that, in the past 10 years that I didn't even know about. Things were easier for him. He You know, he was handsome and all, and he just had these gifts that you would have probably thought were blessings that might have been curses because it made it easier for him, and he didn't value some of the same things that you have to value when you struggle to get them. You know, so this whole thing that happened that ended up that I thought was such a terrible thing was really a pretty phenomenal blessing. It has brought me good things in my life since.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us to stay up to date with our weekly episodes. We'll see you next time.